Um, and then I'll upload this to our YouTube channel in the next week or so, but it's good that you're here live because then you can get your questions answered. So um, I'd like the ambassadors to introduce themselves. Unfortunately, we no longer have Medea with us. She's not able to make it anymore, so we don't have a medic. However, the interviews are probably quite similar, and I know that especially for first year in Bionatskin and Vet Med, you have a lot of similar content. So I'm sure the other ambassadors can more than answer your questions. So if you want to start with Ella, can you just introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ella. I'm a sixth year vet med student.
Lavinia,
I'm Lavinia. I'm a first year Bionatsky student.
and then Lewis.
Yep. So I'm Lewis. I'm a first year Bionatsky too.
And can I just double check? Did you two both have your interviews online as well?
We did,
Yeah.
yeah.
And Ella, did you have yours in person?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so we can cover a few different colleges because I know some colleges will be interviewing in person, some online. If you haven't heard back yet about your interview, do not worry. For some subjects, we've only just received your ESAT results, for example. So we may be waiting to get your ESAT results and kind of process them before we invite you to interview. So whether you've heard back already or you're still waiting, it doesn't matter. Hopefully, this is still relevant for you. So why do we actually interview at Cambridge? We receive a lot of applications, especially in these subjects for things like medicine and NatSci. We have a lot of applicants, and therefore the interviews um, allow us to get to know you a bit better and also to see how well you would suit the Cambridge system because we do supervise here. We have these supervisions where we talk to you sometimes with two students, three students, sometimes one-on-one, and the interview is a good way to assess how you would respond in that kind of teaching scenario. Um, your interests might not really align with this course, and that might not be super clear from your personal statement, and we can ask you more targeted questions in an interview. Now, most candidates will have two interviews. Each one will be about 25 minutes long. If you have them online, we will try and schedule them almost back to back. So you'll have an hour-long slot with a 5-minute break in between the two. So you'll go for one for 25 minutes, have that 5-minute break, and then your next one will start at the half hour. If you do them in person, if you come to college, they might be at different times of the day. You might have a lunch break, things like that. Um, and in each interview, you will typically have two interviewers. So they will both be people who teach your subject. They might belong to that college, or they might be, say, people who work in the central departments, people who are maybe PhD students who have been asked to help out with the interview period. Typically, one of the people interviewing you will be your director of studies in that subject at that college. So the medicine director of studies will, for example, interview for the medics at Magdalene. Um, and the types of questions you'll be asked will be the same, whether you're in person or online. We try and keep it the same regardless, just to kind of have that, standard across all the colleges. So therefore, if you get put in the winter pool, for example, if maybe the college you applied to doesn't have space for you, but another college wants to see you, they can see that you were interviewed in a different format, but trust that you were asked the same sort of questions. Now, will you be asked? Typically, for these kind of interviews, we won't ask you too much about things like your personal statement or your interests outside of your course. It will really be about your ability within the subject. So we might ask you to apply scientific concepts or to look at graphs and data, and to communicate your ideas throughout these problems. And we have some sample questions which the ambassadors are going to talk through, so you'll see how they show these skills when they approach those questions. But those of you applying to medicine, and maybe even some for vet med, and Ella might be able to talk a bit about this, there might also be some questions about ethics and legal and ethical concepts to consider. And for medicine, it might be also about things like the NHS and careers in the NHS, just having a bit of an awareness of what is going on. So I would recommend if you aren't really that clued in on that, maybe it might be worth looking at some BBC News articles. For example, there was an assisted dying bill passed through the government this year. It was debated, is in a lot of newspapers. It might be worth reading a bit about that. I imagine that'd be quite a good question to come up at an interview this year. So just kind of know what's going on in the world, not just about biology and chemistry. What we don't really care about is things like how you dress or your accent. People think they have to, dress smartly. You do not have to at all. That is a complete misconception about the interview. You do not have to get every single question right. Quite frankly, interviews are there to push you to your limit. We want to see where your knowledge kind of ceases to exist, and then we see if we can maybe give you a hint, work through some questions. So they always want to get to a point where you're getting things wrong. So don't worry if things aren't going right. They'll get into that limit with you to see what do you know and what don't you know already. Um, you probably will not be asked a really obscure question. If a question seems obscure, maybe think, is this related to something? Can I link it to something? Because they're maybe seeing that link that you're not. So they're also trying to see, can you link concepts together? In terms of dressing smartly, if you want to dress in your school uniform, that's completely fine. Maybe don't wear your pajamas, but you do not have to dress smartly. You don't have to ask a question at the end. That's not needed. If you genuinely have questions about the course or about the interviewers, interests, you can ask them. It's a great time to inquire about the course, but they're not going to mark you down because you haven't asked a question about that. And this is not the only part of the application that counts. Some people think that, once you get to the interview, everything that comes before the interview is disregarded and it's only the interview. That's not the case. Some people don't score that well in an interview. They get a slightly lower interview score, but they did really well in the ESAT or the UCAT, or they did really well with their personal statement and their grades are high that they predicted, and therefore they kind of counter out the fact that their interview maybe wasn't as strong. So don't worry that if you kind of flop the interview, that's the end of the road for you. That might not be the case. And what do we actually want to see? I think demonstrating problem-solving skills is really good and being able to show that engagement and enthusiasm for the subject. So when you're speaking, show that enthusiasm, show that you can link your various interests to the problems, and that I think not being stubborn, being able to kind of see a different point of view if it maybe is more of an ethical question, especially, and that that flexibility, that reasoning, and being able to think out loud. So when you are working for a problem, not just kind of being quiet and then saying the correct answer at the end, but thinking through your kind of train of thought. And hopefully the ambassadors will kind of show that when they're working for the problems, they'll think, okay, first I saw this and now I'm working through this. And I think that's the kind of perfect way to demonstrate your reasoning and your analytical kind of skills. Um, Quite a lengthy slide, this one. So how to approach it, comprehend what the question is actually asking, and if you are not sure, please take a moment to pause or to clarify. If some of the words don't make sense or if you're not certain what they're asking, do clarify. We would much rather you say, can you just explain this a different way? Can you maybe define that word you've used, rather than you to go on a 5-minute ramble about something that doesn't make sense to you. Think about what you already know. It's probably related to your GCSE subjects or your A-level subjects, or maybe they've asked a question about your personal statement. I think that's rarer with the biosciences as it would be in the humanities, but they might ask you a question about something you've referenced in a personal statement or work experience, for example. So think back to what they're asking you. Show definitions, evaluate your suggestions out loud. If you've got like a diagram in front of you or a graph, point out, different definitions, point out different um, like data that you can see, and explain your answer and expand. And I think give relevant examples as well. If you can link this to something maybe you've done outside, something you've done in your course, it's quite good to link this back to what you already know. And yes, the last point, be malleable to new ideas. A lot of students will really close up and get quite defensive. Some students will seem quite aggressive and a bit stubborn, and that's not really what we want here. We want people who can work with us and be be teachable, really. So I don't think we don't always want you to stand your ground and be stubborn. They might be playing devil's advocate sometimes, but I think it's still good to be quite open-minded. So I'm going to go into some sample questions, and if any of this hasn't made sense, please do put things in the comments, and we can go back to this for the questions. But I really want to dedicate quite a lot of time to these sample questions so you can see what they look like and how the ambassadors approach them. So this first one is one that I would have given for medicine, and Medea was going to talk about it. Lewis has volunteered to try and talk through this one, so he is very much on the spot, as you would be in an interview. So Lewis, if somebody gave you this graph and said, analyze this graph, tell us your thoughts, there might not be a question so much associated. It might just be analyze this graph. What would you say to that?
Yeah. Yeah, so you're right. Sadly, I'm not a medic, so this isn't quite my area of expertise. But the kind of general trends that we can see here is that for kind of 4 of these 5 conditions, we can see that they're kind of either plateauing or they're decreasing and staying at a low level. So that's for TB, heart disease, diabetes, and measles. And that's kind of what you'd expect to see with that coinciding with the beginning of modern medicine. So the measles vaccine that is given to children or young children that came out, I think, in the early 60s. So that makes sense that that's staying at a low level and declining for things like heart disease as treatments improve. But then we have cancer in the middle there. That's kind of the really interesting thing here. Um, and I personally would say that that increase, it's not because more people are dying from cancer, it's because we know that more people have cancer. So beforehand, there would have been a lot of deaths that weren't attributed to cancer. But now, with the kind of beginning of modern medicine, it's not just the treatments that are improving; it's the diagnostic side of it too. So more people are being diagnosed with cancer, therefore more deaths are being attributed to it. Yeah, so I think that's the main kind of takeaway. That line for cancer there's the most interesting thing. And then you can see that kind of around 1990, that's then starting to decrease. So that's kind of maybe once the diagnostic side of it is kind of reached kind of steady level, that's not improving quite so much, and the treatments are starting to catch up. Yeah, that's kind of everything I took from that. Obviously, there might be some other things, but I'm not quite best suited to answer this question.
No, that's brilliant. Is there any questions you would have about the graph that you would maybe want to, if someone said, what does this graph lack for you to be able to, talk more about it? Is there anything you'd want this graph to show that would give you a bit more data?
Um, I'm kind of what struck me that kind of surprised me a little bit was that increase for measles towards the end. That looks like a relatively significant increase, about twofold maybe. And as I said, measles is a vaccine that nearly all young children in the UK. Oh, okay. So no, this doesn't specify that it's for the UK, does it? So this might be global. That would be useful information to have. Um, so maybe not all the people that are being considered here are vaccinated at a young age. Um, so maybe yeah, the demographics we're having if it's in the UK, that would be some quite useful information to have for this. I think yeah.
Yeah, that was good. That was what I was looking for. I know that this graph, when medics have talked through this before, they said it doesn't tell you which country, and therefore that could really help you identify why certain diseases are more prevalent than others. So yeah, I think they would look for that kind of info. Some graphs I've seen before have also had information redacted, and it's about you spotting what is that information missing for you to interpret a graph or a diagram. So that could be a thing that can almost trip you up. So beware of not just looking at the data there, but maybe what data is missing. Yeah, thank you very much. And our next question. How much blood flows through the left ventricle of a human heart in a year? Who was it that was going to approach this? Was it Lavinia?
Yeah, I'm happy to
Okay.
do that. I think me and Lewis are like interchanging between questions. But with this one, you'd want to firstly kind of approach like you don't know like the amount of blood that flows through the left ventricle in one heartbeat, but you do know a person's heartbeat. Or if you don't know, you can ask. You need to try and get some data points to begin a problem solving question. So you want to know what information you do have and what information you don't. And often in a question like this, I'd say, okay, well, a heartbeat could be 60 to like 100 beats per minute. Okay, so I have this information. It's asking me the amount of blood flow through the left ventricle of a human heart in a year. So I have beats per minute. So how can I convert that into beats per year? Okay, well, let's say that my heart rate is 70 beats per minute. I multiply by 60, which is then the beats per hour. Then I'd multiply by 24, which is the beats per day. And then I'd multiply by 365, which is the 56. Oh my God, 356 days in a year. So then I'd find the beats per year. And then I wouldn't know the amount of volume through the left ventricle flowing for one heartbeat. So I would be able to ask that to the interviewers maybe, because they probably don't expect you to know that at A level. And then I'd multiply the volume that flows through the left ventricle in one heartbeat by the number that I've just created with the information about like the time conversions that I've just made. But yeah, there's lots of information that you're not expected to know, but you can ask the interviewers in order to get like a better sense of the calculations. Also, this is like an estimate. There's lots of estimation questions that you could be asked as well. So don't expect to get it like right on the point, because obviously this varies from person to person. So yeah.
Great. And would they respond? How would someone respond, do you think, if you gave that as an answer about your approximation and kind of talking about beats per hour, things like that? What do you think they would just say, that's great? Would they maybe question that at any point?
Yeah, there are occasions where they could definitely question it, saying like, oh, well, obviously, there's some points where you could be doing exercise, like you need to take that into account. You can't just be resting all the time because your heartbeat is not going to be constant 70 beats per minute like the entire year. And then it might decrease, it might increase. So they might question some things like that, like what scenarios would this change in? And then you might start to think about like, oh, how many hours a year am I doing exercise and what's my heartbeat for that? Or like how many hours a year am I sleeping and what's my heartbeat for that, etc. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Someone has just asked, will you be allowed a calculator?
Yeah.
They've directed that to me. If I think that would depend on the college. A lot of the time in your invite to interview, they will give you a list of what is allowed and not allowed. This might vary, especially between online and in-person interviews, because if you're sat at home, they might not want you to have any other like tech around you in case you're Googling things. So they might say this is what you're allowed, and this isn't what you're allowed. They might say you can have a pen and paper in front of you. So I don't want to say yes or no to a calculator because I think that would depend on your college. So when you get that invite, it will give you all the information in that email. And if they don't mention a calculator, you can always email the admissions team because, like I said, it will vary by college.
You
Okay.
should always be happy to make estimations, round things, and then use those
Yeah.
roundings
Yeah.
in your calculations. I remember doing that, I think, for the question that's coming up next.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes it a lot easier, and if you're unsure if you can have the calculator or not, it makes things a lot quicker. So that's a good thing to be happy doing and kind of get used to doing that before you start the interview.
Thank you. Who was it that was going to approach this one then?
Would you like me to do it?
If you're happy to, yeah.
Yeah. So this was one that I think me and Lavinia both did in our interview last year. And there are kind of lots of different things you can take apart from this. So you're eating 100 grams of chocolate, and what volume of CO2 gas are you exhaling? So the first time kind of through this question, you're going to be looking at, well, obviously CO2, we know that's a product of aerobic respiration. And we're going to assume that that's what we're going to be doing. We're not going to be eating chocolate while going for a high intensity run. So we're going to be assuming it's aerobic, and we know the equation for aerobic respiration. That's 1 molecule of glucose plus 6 of oxygen goes to 6 of CO2 and 6 of H2O, water. And then from this information they've given us, we've been given very conveniently per 100 grams. And I know that if I'm just using that equation that I've just kind of read out, that's just going to be the glucose. And we're going to be assuming that all of the carbohydrates that are sugars are going to be glucose there. So we've got the mass. I'm sure most of you can do this, but we need to convert the mass into the number of moles. So to do that, we're just going to divide that mass by the MR of glucose, which is 7 times 12 plus 16 times 6, which is 180. So that comes out to I imagine, some rather nasty number. You can use some approximations in your calculations, or you can use a calculator if that's allowed. But there we have that gives us a number of moles of glucose. Then going back to our equation, we've got that ratio of glucose to carbon dioxide, which is 1 to 6. So we need to multiply the number of moles of glucose by 6 to work out the number of moles of CO2. And then we're going to be making another assumption. And it's always useful, I think, to kind of state which assumptions you're using and why that might be valid. So here we're going to be assuming that we're going to do this at room temperature and pressure, so that we can use that ideal gas equation. If not, you could use PV equals nRT. But here we're just going to assume that 1 mole of any gas is equal to 24 decimeters cubed. So we've got the number of moles of CO2, and we just need to multiply that by 24 to find out the number of decimeters cubed that we're going to be exhaling. They might want it in decimeters cubed, they might want it in centimeters, they might want it in liters. So it's always useful to know those conversions. Kind of roughly what seems sensible is also quite useful as well. And then I remember doing this, and after that, they asked me kind of what other things might happen, what other data can you use from this table. And from there, you can kind of talk about what other molecules might be used in respiration. So if you weren't eating anything else at this time, you might then maybe digest the other carbohydrates. So that might be things like starch. You wouldn't necessarily be expected to be able to actually do the calculation. Kind of knowing what would happen is kind of what they're looking for. So you've got roughly 10 grams of other carbohydrates. Those would be respired next to produce CO2. And then also, if it's the only thing you're eating, you then respire the fats. There's quite a lot of them there. Again, you wouldn't be expected to know kind of molecular formulae for these things necessarily to do the calculations, but kind of knowing what's going on is important. And then obviously it'll be the proteins next that you'd respire, but ideally that's not going to be happening because that's really not very good for you. Yeah, so kind of talking through the other possibilities of things that you could do with this calculation after you've kind of done that initial one with the glucose only.
Someone's just put in the chat, would you use the mass of carbohydrate or sugar? Which one would you use?
So you'd use one of which sugars to initially. So in the equation that we've got for respiration, glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water. We're just going to be taking glucose, which from this data here is just the sugars. But as I said, after you've done that calculation, it might be kind of interesting to talk about what the other food groups might, kind of how they might impact your calculation.
Okay. Someone else has asked, would you assume a certain number of glucose molecules are in the carbohydrate?
You could do, as I said, I don't think they'd expect you to calculate this, but you know, the starch, glycogen, they're polymers of glucose. So if you were, in theory, if you were given the molecular formula of these, you'd be able to calculate the number of glucose molecules. But I don't think that's something they'd expect you to do.
Okay. And one final one, would you mention the energy at all? Would you talk about that?
I would not. Um,
Yeah.
I don't see a direct link of how this kind of links in. I think this is a kind of relatively standard. It starts out as kind of standard chemistry moles calculation, and they're not looking to test you necessarily on the more physical side of it. I don't think.
Yeah, I was just going to add, like, the point of the question is more to see if you know, obviously, your chemistry calculations, but also the function of different biological molecules. So the energy is kind of irrelevant in this question.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll go on to the next one. I'll see if there's one that Ella's able to answer. Ella, on the spot, would you be able to have a bit of a go at this then? Maybe just talk through. So this is maybe one more aimed at, say, medicine. But I'm going to throw it to Ella as a vet med here just to see if she could maybe come up with something on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. So with ethics questions, it's really important to talk about both sides of the argument. And it doesn't matter if you have a different view to your interviewer. Your main thing is creating a balanced argument and supporting your views. So in this case, should vaccination of children become mandatory? Some of the pros I would talk about would be prevention of disease. We can talk about herd protection, how even if an entire population isn't vaccinated, if the majority is, we still protect those few that aren't. And an example we can use of how effective vaccination is the diseases that we've managed to eradicate, for example, polio and smallpox. We can also talk about why it shouldn't become mandatory, though, and how some people might have arguments against it. For example, the minority that will have reactions to vaccinations. However, we saw obviously in the wake of COVID-19, and that can be a really good thing to bring in, as it's obviously a very recent vaccination, how there was a lot of scare of people getting scared about the side effects of a potentially unknown vaccination. But despite that, we still saw vaccination making a real effect. And we can talk about as well how this, as long as the majority of people are getting vaccinated, then that can protect our small number that we previously mentioned that might have reactions to vaccinations and might be concerned about getting vaccinated.
And do you think there are any, do you think somebody would maybe debate you on any of these? Would you maybe get some back and forth with the interviewer? Would they argue against your points?
Yeah, definitely. I think ethics questions are a great chance for the interviewer to really like question you and really make you think. So be prepared to back up your arguments.
Okay, thank you very much. There are some more questions that came in just about the slide before, and I'll go back to them while we're on it. So let me see. I had a question in the comments saying, would you not factor anaerobic respiration into account? And someone said, why would you not use sugars instead of carbohydrates to calculate? Why would you use sugars instead of carbs to calculate the value? So I was wondering if you could clarify this before we move on too far.
So you can obviously only use, say you've got a set number of glucose molecules, you can only use one type of respiration for one molecule. You can't split, well, you could split them, but I don't know, it's one of the assumptions you're going to make that you're going to be doing aerobic respiration. That's something you would ideally explain to the interviewer. You could choose to do it with anaerobic, and if you've shown that that's a kind of conscious decision you've made, that's completely fine, and they'll understand that if you've got kind of a good reasoning for it. Sorry, the other question was.
It was like,
oh yes, so
yeah.
that's probably to do with the speed of digestion. So your simple sugars like glucose, you're able to respire them very quickly since they're already in the correct kind of isomerization. The more complex carbohydrates like starch, they're going to take some time to do the digestion and get them in the correct form of glucose to do respiration. So as I said, that's kind of one of the things that they might be looking for after you've done the initial calculation, if you're kind of taking into account maybe the kind of time scale that this is happening on. So maybe initially, if you're just respiring the glucose, you'll get a certain volume of CO2, and then maybe after a little bit more time, once you've had time to digest the other polymers like starch into glucose, there might be a raised volume of CO2 produced. But I would certainly kind of just show your understanding initially, just start with glucose because you can actually do the calculation there.
And just to kind of clarify, how long would you spend on a typical question like this? So in your 25-minute interview, how many questions would you say you get asked, and how many would you kind of be picking up like this for a long time?
So when we did this last year, we had two interviewers for each interview being about 25 minutes. And this was so each person in the interview will kind of have their own set of questions. So maybe that's kind of 10 to 15 minutes on kind of this kind of data question. So initially, maybe you want to spend 5 minutes going through the initial calculation with glucose really clearly. And then after that, that might be another 5 minutes or so talking about the other groups and how those might affect the calculation.
Okay, thank you. Someone has also asked about the vaccine question, so I'll move forward to that one. They've said for the vaccine question, would you mention the possibility of antigen variability or potential use of resources because of if this was mandatory? Would also vaccines for all viruses be mandatory, even though they're less harmful and that people have immunity towards? So I guess those are the kind of questions that an interviewer might say pose to you, for example.
Yeah, they definitely could be, and it's definitely something you can bring in if you want to. And if they want to take it in that direction, they can ask you more questions on that direction, or they might want to steer it in a different direction. But that's definitely something you can bring in.
Right. And I think just to clarify, people are obviously commenting a lot about what you're missing or what you should maybe have answered instead. We're not expecting you to get every single thing of part of these sample questions right. There are lots of sides to the debate of vaccinations that I'm sure you won't even have time for in the interview to discuss all the elements. They want to see how quickly you can think. And they know that on the spot, things that you might be able to think about now when you're kind of sat at home and this is a bit of a stress-free environment, you might not be able to come up with, but in a very stressful environment of an interview, you might not be thinking off the top of your head quite as well. So don't worry if you kind of come out of your interview and you think, oh, why didn't I mention antigen variability? They're not expecting you to remember everything. So don't worry about kind of coming out and think, oh, I could have answered this, I could have suggested this. Why didn't I bring that into the equation? I wouldn't worry about that. To move forward, we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you any more questions come in, please do put them in the chat. You can send them to me. I think you can just send them to the group as well, so other people can see your questions, and we will come back to them. But for now, I'll talk about how you actually can prepare, and maybe the ambassadors can chip in on this as well. I think staying up to date with current affairs for things like medicine, especially, is quite useful. Know a bit about the NHS, like I said before. Read over your personal statement. I don't think, and maybe the ambassadors can say if they were asked about it, I don't think personal statement is as relevant for the science subjects as it is for the arts and humanities. But they might ask you this to kind of like warm you up, kind of you get into the interview, and they might ask you one question just to kind of settle you in and make sure you're comfortable But I think really it's about revising your A-level subjects, making sure you know those formulas that they mentioned and those conversions, um, and practice those problem-solving questions aloud. If you have questions in your A-levels that you're currently looking at, when you're doing some homework, work through them out loud and think, if I was explaining this to somebody, if I explained why I'm approaching it this way, what would I talk through in the same way that all the ambassadors then were talking through those questions and what they're considering and what equations they're bringing in, talk through them out loud so that we can see that demonstration. And if you have work experience, if you've done things like medicine or vet med work experience, can you also explain what you've learned from it? So maybe some of the practical skills you'd apply to the course while you're here. And ambassadors, do you have anything to add to how you can prepare for those interviews?
Um, I was going to say, I can't stress enough how revise relevant A-level subjects is, because often people will try and find out incredibly specific or complicated things to talk about in their interview, or they're like, oh, they'll probably ask me about this complicated biology concept that I've never encountered before, so I need to make sure that I've got it. But they're not looking for that at all. I mean, in my experience, a lot of the questions I was asked were things in A-level biology that were like really simple concepts and introduced to us in A level, and then they tried to like make them more complicated and build upon that. And I think it's very important that you've got your foundations correct. Because there were like quite a few questions where I stumbled and I was like, oh my gosh, I learned this at A level and I actually can't remember what it was. So make sure that you've got the foundations really well in your head, because a lot of the questions might actually build from those. They'll ask you a simple question about A-level biology and then they'll try and like see where you can go from there if you're introduced to more complicated things. But don't try and seek stuff that's really complicated to show that you know more than the A-level biology curriculum, because that's really not what they want most of the time or ever.
Any other
I
recommendations?
I'd
Go ahead.
You talked a little bit about personal statement stuff. In both my interviews, I had a question at the start of them that was based off my personal statement. I don't think they don't take your answers into consideration particularly. Um, but it's not a good look to stumble on something you've said you know about. And at the same time, it's equally not going to boost your confidence if you struggle answering a question that you at the start of your interview as well, and something you think you know a bit about. So make sure you can give interesting answers for the stuff that you've put in your personal statement. And then something else that we haven't seen today was that I got a couple of different electron micrographs in my interviews. So just being used to kind of what type of microscope this might have come from, kind of knowing a couple of standard structures to know what a cell membrane looks like, that kind of thing. Um, and then, as Lavinia was saying, make sure you know the basics of biology kind of really well. Make sure you know the structures of your different molecules, your kind of nucleic acids, ATP, your different sugars, fats, that kind of thing. Make sure you kind of be able to draw them, even if it's just in a kind of showing the shapes with labels. That kind of thing's really important.
When you did yours online, were you asked to use your whiteboard to draw those things?
I was asked to use a whiteboard, but it wasn't the one that we'd been told about beforehand. So I was slightly shaken by that. The one of my interviewers had their own system running, which worked in the end, but it wasn't what I was expecting. So you should be ready to kind of face that. I don't think Maudlin does the kind of system where they have you with a pen and paper and the camera pointing down at that. So you're going to have online ones, I think.
Yes, typically if we ask you to use the whiteboard, we will let you know this. I mean, this is how Maudlin runs. I know that some of you might be applying for other colleges. If we think you're going to use the whiteboard at interview, we'll send you instructions about this when we invite you for interview. And we tell you how to use a Zoom whiteboard. It would be worth practicing this. I don't need to only, ever use a Zoom whiteboard on your day of your interview. It'll be good to kind of practice drawing some graphs or some equations there. If you need to say buy a stylus for that, like for an iPad, that might be useful. But you will get that information when you're invited to interview, and it won't be for every subject. So just if they mention that you might use it, it'll be good to have a go at practicing on a whiteboard. Ella, do you have any recommendations for how to prepare for the interviews?
Yeah, I was also asked about my personal statement, and I know a lot of vets are and medics too. I'd specifically mentioned my EPQ in mine, so I was asked about that. And if you've mentioned any specific books or papers you've read, be prepared to talk about that. But beyond the stuff you've mentioned in your personal statement, again, like the others have said, I'd really emphasize just being comfortable with your A-level subjects. And if you get a question that you read or you hear and you think, I have absolutely no idea, think again because they're not going to ask you something that you have absolutely no idea. You will know the basic concepts from your subjects and you will be able to lead into the question that they're asking. So, for example, the question with the respiration that the other two went through, at first thought you might look at that and go, I have absolutely no idea how to answer that. But as they showed, you really do know from your biology. And so it's just not panicking if you see a question and think, I have no idea what's going on with that. And then also stay up to date with current affairs. I would really emphasize that for medicine interviews and vet med interviews because they can ask you questions about what's going on in current affairs. So have a quick Google, have a read around. And if there's any ethical issues as well in your field, have an opinion on them.
And someone said, will you be asked about questions from your My Cambridge application? So, Ella, that might have been the SQA when you applied. You will have written a Cambridge specific personal statement, some of you. Were any of your questions about that, or was it just your general personal statement?
Mine was just my general personal statement.
I mean, they can ask you about, they have access to your My Cambridge application, so I would revise that as well. If you said something specific about the Cambridge course and that extra personal statement, I think that's completely fair to ask about that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Somebody has asked about maths, and they've said it specifically for PBS, but I'm going to throw it to any of you. Because did you do A level maths? Any of you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But did anybody ask any maths related questions at interview?
Well, not to do with mathematical concepts, but I have heard of someone else that got asked a question about like forming a graph based on an equation that they could create to do with like biological populations. But this was like someone I met like a year ago, so I'm not entirely sure. But they could, I suppose. You do tell them which A-level subjects you do and which topics you've done in the My Cambridge application, so they could definitely pick out things from that.
And if
Yeah. Oh,
this
go ahead.
this didn't happen to me, but I was told about people that had it. If they haven't looked at your My Cambridge and they ask you some maths that you really don't know how to do, and it just looks like something you haven't been taught to do yet, which can happen, just say that you don't think you've covered this yet, and often you'll be correct. I knew someone that got asked a second year integration question, and they hadn't covered that until I think March of upper sixth. So that was obviously not something they could even attempt. So just make that very clear if you don't think you can do it.
Yeah, hopefully that doesn't happen to you. But if you think we haven't covered this yet, we do know which modules we're doing. We know which exam boards we're doing because you've put that on the My Cambridge application. So if they do ask you that, that would be a fault on us, and I would apologise for that. But if they ask you a question that you haven't covered yet, please be quite confident in saying we haven't done this yet, and then you won't be, you know, that won't show against you in the interview. Okay, I'll come back to the rest of the questions for the Q&A just so that we can go through the PowerPoint now. Okay, so I've linked here some online mock interviews, and these are made by Cambridge. They're made by different colleges. A lot of them are online, in person, kind of filmed interviews, and they're done with ambassadors. So they're not real life interviews, but they mimic the kind of questions that we would ask, and they have current students answering the questions, and they normally have two interviewers. So you can see what it would look like, especially an in-person one, and the kind of questions we'll cover. Now, a medic that I've spoken to before said that she used this medicine one, the one that I've linked, and this could be good revision for you, and that she actually played this, and then when they asked the question, she paused it, and then she spoke to her computer as if she was speaking in the interview, and kind of did her own mock interview with this, and then she unpaused it to see what the student had come up with, and kind of treated it like that. So I've got a medicine one and a natural sciences one, and then there's one that's generic. I think there's some various questions in that, so that's more just to get the right format. There might not be that many science questions on the generic one, but if anybody wants to take a photo of any of these, please feel free. And if you did go on the YouTube and typed in Cambridge interview, look look who's made them. If they say a Cambridge College, I think they're probably quite legit, and you can probably trust them. If there's somebody else, some kind of study tuber recommending their mock interview, I wouldn't necessarily believe it. So please make sure you get correct resources here. But I would recommend these three. I've kind of vetted these already. And in regards to mock interviews, I know that some schools offer them. You can take them up. I would advise against paying, so seeking out any kind of private companies doing mock interviews. I don't think they would be that useful. if your school offers it, it can be good just to see the format. Before I came to Cambridge, I had a mock interview in my school, and it was nothing like my Cambridge interview. So I wouldn't. That's why I wouldn't pay for them because they might not be that useful. They might not really be preparing you in the right way. And I think if you get too kind of good at mock interviews or do too many, you might start to prepare or rehearse answers. You might sound a bit kind of like you're doing a performance, a speech rather than you're speaking, naturally off the top of your head. So don't over rehearse what you're going to say. It's just good to read through your personal statement, as the student said, and know that biology and chemistry, quite well. Other than that, I don't think it's necessary to do a mock interview. Did any of you guys have a mock interview? Did you think they were useful?
Yeah, I had one, and yeah, it wasn't like my Cambridge interview at all.
Yeah, I don't think they're often going to be exactly like them. I think the useful thing from the ones that I did was just speaking to someone I didn't know about things I didn't particularly know about. It's just getting confident going through the process of talking through your answers.
Yeah, I asked my biology teacher to do one, and it was okay, but it was nothing like my Cambridge interview. His were more like abstract questions, and also I'd often get my friends to like look at my personal statement and see like if they could ask me questions on that. But then again, with sciences, it's not that focused on your personal statement, so yeah, take that with a pinch of salt.
Someone's asked me to put the links in the chat, so I'll try and copy them over when we're doing the Q&A. I'll just kind of get to that point so you can reference them at the end. Okay, and finally, any advice that the ambassadors have, feel free to give any kind of final parting words of wisdom while I copy these questions, the
Um,
link, sorry.
I was going to say one thing that I did um, was a massive mistake is like an hour before my interview, I forgot my passport at home. So remember your ID before you do your interview, because otherwise you will be under a lot of stress.
Anyone else?
Um, this is kind of partly under the recommendations of how to prepare. But I remember I did a couple of questions from Isaac Science. That's a website I think it's actually run by Cambridge somehow. But it's basically a lot of questions that are kind of based around your A-level subjects that might be in unfamiliar context. So kind of working through them and getting used to applying your knowledge to unfamiliar circumstances is, I found that was quite useful.
Just stay calm. Don't worry if you don't know the answer. They're not interested in the knowledge you currently have. They're interested in how your brain works and if you're teachable and if you do well in these small group settings. So don't worry if you're not entirely sure. Just try and engage with them. Try and have a specific scientific conversation with them and try and enjoy it because you'll end up talking about a subject that you do really enjoy. And it's scary, but I actually came out of my second interview having quite enjoyed it.
Okay, brilliant. So now we'll go on to the Q&A. So I'm going to end the recording here. Um, so yeah, none of your questions will be recorded or published online. So please feel free to ask anything you want.